going on, vinyl community? Welcome to another video with the Record Spinner. In today's video, I'm going to be showcasing 5 career-defining Japanese live albums. This is a bit of a niche topic, but it did get me thinking about the many live albums that have come out from certain bands and how coincidentally they were recorded in Japan and they somewhat benefited their career. Now, this can all boil down to a band's reputation as a live act or how these albums basically set them on the map, and I figured that this would be a fun concept to tackle and also shine a light on, since you would be surprised by the albums that I mention, how great they are and how they shine in an artist's repertoire. So enough of the chit chat, let's jump into what this video is all about. First up is perhaps one of the most notable Japanese live albums, as it does mention the country's name in the album title, and that is Deep Purple's Made in Japan. Leading up to around 1972, Deep Purple had established themselves as a highly reputable stage act, with their most notable lineup being the Mark II lineup consisting of Ritchie Blackmore, John Lord, Ian Pace, Ian Gillan, and Roger Glover. Now, while some of their shows were privately recorded or broadcasted on radio, they felt that releasing a live album simply wouldn't capture the energy of their live shows. But at the same time, there was a bootleg called H-Bomb making the rounds from a Deep Purple show in Aachen in 1970, and they saw the opportunity of releasing a live album as a way to combat the bootleg market. Plus, Warner Brothers saw it as an opportunity to capitalize on the success the band had developed in Japan, and the album would exclusively be released in Japan, and the band agreed to do it only on the conditions that the band had a say in regards to the equipment that they used. They hired their engineer Martin Birch to record the shows, and the band would have a say in whether the album would come out or not if the recordings were to their liking. So sure enough, Martin Birch recorded the 2 shows in Osaka and 1 in Tokyo, and the end result is one of the greatest hard rock live albums ever. Warner Brothers ended up going against the band's wishes to release the album solely in Japan, and they released it worldwide, and it was a commercial success, having gone platinum in just 2 weeks, and the band earned a hit single with the live version of Smoke on the Water, coupled with the studio version from Machine Head, and it's perhaps because of that that the riff of the song is perhaps one of the most recognizable riffs ever. But in all seriousness, if you want to get into the essence of Deep Purple and what makes them such a great live band, Made in Japan is an album that you have to experience. Okay, so I have to throw in a Kiss release somewhere since they are my favorite band, and it is in the form of a bootleg called Kiss Alive 2, The Outtakes. Now, this bootleg consists of an unreleased live album that was initially going to be released exclusively in Japan in 1977 called Rock and Roll Party in Tokyo. It was recorded over 4 shows at the Budokan during Kiss's first Japanese tour in April of 1977, and this is where the origins of what would become Alive 2 originate from. Now, Eddie Kramer did finalize some mixes for the album, but when they were done in the summer of 1977, the band had already recorded and released Love Gun and started to tour for it, and then when they did the 3 shows at the LA Forum, those shows were recorded for what would become Kiss Alive 2. So Rock and Roll Party in Tokyo was ultimately scrapped, whether it was for that reason or the fact that Kiss and Casablanca felt that the tapes were unusable. But I do find that statement hard to believe, because they did use portions of the Japanese tapes for the final Alive 2 album. So I think it may have been a case of, other projects taking precedence. But anyways, I digress. The band is absolutely on fire on this release. Japan was a country that truly welcomed and embraced Kiss, of course, for obvious reasons, since the makeup was very reminiscent of the kabuki arts, and the superhero-type personas resonated with Japanese culture with the likes of Godzilla and others. I think it surely would have been interesting how history would have been written differently if this album were to be released and the public was suspecting a live album after every 3 studio albums, which was the pattern they ultimately found themselves in between Kiss Live and Alive 2. Whether it would have been only available via Japan, just like Deep Purple's Made in Japan was supposed to be, or it would ultimately be released in the States, it would have stood out for being a notable piece of history. Next up is The Runaways, live in Japan. I absolutely love the Runaways, an absolutely kick-ass all-female rock band, a very short-lived group with a rather turbulent history in regards to Kim Fowley and such, which we are not going to go in great detail about. While they didn't find much success here in the US, the only place they found huge success was in Japan, and when they went there for their only Japanese tour in 1977, it was the equivalent of Beatlemania, with all of the hysteria of the fans greeting them at the airport, a string of sold-out shows, and a ton of TV appearances. But even with all of that taken into account, it was only after this tour that it was the beginning of the end of the band, since Sherry Curry and Jackie Fox would leave the band, and the rest of them kind of just stuck around until the band basically dwindled. It is a real shame because these girls had tons of potential, but the solo careers of Joan Jett and Lita Ford would bring on bigger fortunes. But anyways, not to get sidetracked here, all of the success that they had in Japan made sense to put out a live album exclusive for the Japanese market, and this album is such a fun listen from start to finish. It has tons of Runaways classics such as Queens of Noise, California Paradise, and Cherry Bomb. They also do some covers such as the Troggs' Wild Thing and Velvet Underground's Rock and Roll. And there's also some songs on here that don't appear on any of their studio albums, such as All Right You Guys, Getting Hot, and I Want to Be Where the Boys Are. Those songs alone are perhaps the highlights of this record for me. Overall, this is such a solid live album from a short-lived, underrated band that just happened to land some major success in the country where this record was recorded. Next up is an absolute classic, and that is Cheap Trick at Budokan. This was the album that really kickstarted the band's popularity after having released 3 studio albums, and the same deal as the Runaways. It was very much like Beatlemania when they toured Japan in the spring of 1978. And already I am noticing a pattern with all of these albums. Bands wanting to capitalize on successes in different countries, so they decide to release a live album exclusively for said country, and that's exactly what the original intent of Cheap Trick at Budokan was when it was originally released in October 1978 solely in Japan. And while all of this was going on, based off of the success of the single Surrender, which came off of their album Heaven Tonight, which came out at the same time as this Japanese tour was going on, there was a promo album called From Tokyo to You that was getting heavy radio airplay, and 30,000 imported copies of Cheap Trick at Budokan was sold in the States. So there was certainly a demand to get this album out to other parts of the world. And at the same time, their next album, Dream Police, was already in the can, ready to go. So in February 1979, Budokan came out, and then Dream Police got pushed back towards September that same year. And based on word of mouth and heavy airplay, this album ended up going triple platinum, spawned a hit single with the live version of I Want You to Want Me, and it propelled Cheap Trick into international superstardom. And this live album is absolutely phenomenal from start to finish. It opens up with one of the best concert openers ever called Hello There. Lookout is one of my favorites. It never appeared on a studio album, as it only appears here. Need Your Love appears first on this, but the studio version can be found on Dream Police. They do a cover of Fats Domino's Ain't That a Shame, which was released as a single. And of course, I Want You to Want Me and Surrender. And then it wraps up with a finale-esque reprise of Hello There called Good Night. And then it wraps up with Clock Strikes 10. You really can't go wrong with this. Now, what I am holding up is not necessarily the original 1978 live album. This is Cheap Trick at Budokan, the complete concert, which brings together all of the tracks the band performed. Almost half of it didn't make it onto the final album, such as Hello Kitties, Oh Caroline, Southern Girls, and much more. It's basically you get 2 albums worth of material with this version. It is definitely an essential record to own. Last but certainly not least is Judas Priest Unleashed in the East. Or is it Unleashed in the Studio? We'll get to that in a moment. This was recorded during the band's Hellbent for Leather tour in 1979, and I think the timing as to when this album came out couldn't have been more perfect because this album became their best-selling album up at this point. It reached the US Top 100 and UK Top 10, and it is one of the few Priest albums to reach platinum certification in the US. But aside from all of those accolades, it was the first Priest album to be produced by Tom Allom, who would go on to work with the band for the next 10 years, and it was around this time that the band sort of found their true musical identity, because leading up to this live album, Judas Priest had evolved from initially being a sort of heavy blues band that worked in some intricate, almost progressive rock elements in their sound, with some light and shade in their instrumentation, with a sense of heaviness that was prevalent with bands such as Black Sabbath. And by the time of Killing Machine, which was the album that came out before this, they adapted more of a radio-friendly approach with their style, and it very much was boiled down to its essence. But outside of music, they finally consolidated their leather and studs image, which is what many fans associate them with. So within this period of Priest's career, there was a lot going on for them, and this live album is such a rocking listen from start to finish. Opens up with the driving Exciter. There are some early favorites on here, such as The Ripper and The Soaring Victim of Changes, and there's even some covers, such as Joan Baez's Diamonds and Rust, and Fleetwood Mac's Green Manalishi with the Two-Prong Crown. The later, I feel, is best heard on this album. Now, when it comes to live albums in general, and I'm shocked I didn't comment on this for the other ones that I've discussed in this video, because believe me, it occurs for others. There is sometimes the addition of studio trickery added to perfect the imperfections of the recordings, whether it's mistakes made during the performances or technological difficulties. And in the case of Unleashed in the East, it's sometimes labeled Unleashed in the Studio, because Rob Halford has stated many times that the music itself is indeed live, but the vocals weren't recorded properly, so we had to re-record them in the studio, but in a concert live studio setting. So I take it that it adds more to the atmosphere as you're re-recording the vocals. Regardless, it sounds perfect, and it is one of the best heavy metal live albums ever. So there you guys go. Those are 5 career-defining Japanese live albums. What Japanese live albums do you guys particularly enjoy? Please drop a comment down below. I'd love to know. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead, give it a like, subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support this channel, be sure to check me out on Patreon. See you guys in the next video. And most importantly, keep the records spinning.